Hey everyone, this is Erica Lucas, your host and founding member of VEST, an organization connecting women across industries, regions, and career levels so that together we can expedite the pipeline of more women in positions of power and influence. Welcome to another episode of the Vester podcast, where we explore the invisible barriers holding women back in the workplace and share stories of women building power collectively.
In order to build a more equitable women's power, we have to all play our position, meaning we all, inevitably, and this is not just race and class and gender and sexuality, but everything that we are brings us into a certain dynamic in the workplace. Some people experience anti-gay harassment or gender harassment based on being non-binary or trans, all of these different things. And we have to begin to understand that the way that we're treated in the workplace may not be the way our colleagues are treated.
True or false? Some of our biggest adversaries in the workplace have been other women. Women have often been put in situations where we felt like we had to be territorial. This often leads to a cultural divide and competitive landscape among women. How do we break up with this notion so we can claim power collectively in a way that still acknowledges the roots we have and the lessons we need to learn from and with each other? To coach us through this session, we invited Farai Chidea. Farai is a prolific author and multimedia journalist whose work has been featured in CNN, Newsweek, NPR, and more. She's also the host of her own podcast, Our Body Politic, where she unapologetically reports how women of color impacts today's major political events, and where she has led fruitful and balanced conversations with culture makers, politicians, artists, and leaders. This session was recorded in August as part of a more intimate coaching session with VEST members and has been repurposed to accommodate this episode. Special thanks to Matra Jones, VEST member and executive director of the Langston University Foundation, for moderating this session.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Happy Wednesday. I am Matra Staley Jones, a proud C-Suite VEST member, and I am delighted to welcome you to today's program. I joined VEST because I wanted to be supported by a network of women who are honest, open, and invested in other women's success. And let me tell you, as one of the early members, I have not been disappointed. In fact, the expectations that I've had coming into this incredible platform, I have not been disappointed. I have been so enlightened. I've been fulfilled. My cup is always certainly filled up by the programming that we have, because we're not scared to have the difficult conversations, and we're not scared to engage with one another, knowing at the beginning of the day, we want to ensure each other's success. And we want to have some conversations about some things that we wish we would have known as we were emerging leaders. Certainly, I am of the opinion that we still learn every day. I am learning every day. And so even being able to learn at this stage in my career and life has been sensational. Ms. Farai, and really want you to start off by telling us a little bit about the work that you're doing at the Ford Foundation, particularly as it relates to gender in the newsroom.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I'm wrapping up my time at the Ford Foundation. I'm still there, but we'll be wrapping up this fall after 4 incredible years. And my background is mainly in journalism with, side trips into academia and tech. And I got a call recruiting me to Ford, and I didn't think of going into philanthropy, but it's been so rewarding. We did a huge event and then also report on gender in the newsrooms, but it went beyond that into gender period in workplaces. So for example, our keynote speaker was Iris Bonet, who is the founder of the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And I'm actually going to be a non-resident fellow at that program, which they call WAP, this fall. And the reason that Iris's work is so great is that she uses evidence-based research that is truly intersectional and looking at both race and gender to look at things like employee evaluations and how Black women in particular and women of color generally tend to have lower advancement outcomes despite producing great work. Like if you break people into quintiles by performance, and 4 and 5, the top quintiles, Black women who are 4s and 5s don't do better than the 3s. And I have a lot of theories about that. One of them is that people find Black women who are successful intimidating. And as an example of that, pertaining specifically to the media, but anywhere, there was someone I know who was applying to fill an empty spot, above her. And she was told in the end, when she wasn't chosen, that the teams, and this is at a major US news organization, a national, global network, they said, people don't like reporting to Black women. Literally, that was the answer they gave her. So they're like, people don't like Black women leading. And of course, that's actionable for a lawsuit. I said, look, you've got to either file a suit or get out of there, because now that they have done something actionable, if you don't leave, they will try to destroy your reputation to prove why they didn't promote you. And that's also what happened. I mean, she's someone who's the primary breadwinner. Her husband earns less. They've got a kid. They live in New York, which is expensive. And I get why she didn't leave, but from my own experience of having had harassment and discrimination in the workplace, as so many of us do, I was like, they're going to come for you because they've laid their cards on the table. And people don't often think, discrimination that blatant. If people who are not women of color don't think things get that blatant, but they still do, even when they're in defiance of, all of the laws and all of the rules, because people move faster than laws. People, move slower than laws, mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I really loved was working with Iris Bonet, who is a professor and who was, a dean for a while at the dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, is that she's a Swiss born and raised behavioral economist. She works with clients like the Nobel Prize Committee on debiasing systems. And her whole thing, she has a book called What Works. I highly recommend. I'll just put her name in the chat. Iris Bonet.
Sure.
What Works. But what I love about the work I've been able to do at Ford is, in addition to being able to give away millions of dollars a year to different grantees in journalism and media and public policy, we also are able to convene practitioners and topic-based experts in powerful ways. And I believe, like the kind of learning that we're doing here today and the kind of sharing that we're doing here today is part of that, great opportunity. So that's been
absolutely, absolutely,
that's been a real highlight for me.
What is the cultural divide among women?
Well, I think that it's not a shock that white women and women of color have different approaches to the workplace sometimes, and sometimes are not always allies. I gave a big speech for a major conference in New York a couple of years ago where I focused in on that. I focused in on the workplace tensions between white women and women of color. And not every workplace has them, but, and forgive me if what I'm saying sounds too out there or too aggressive. I'm not coming from that place. I'm coming from a position of shared learning. When we look at American politics, for example, and politics has been the core of my reporting experience, white women have many times exercised political power through white men, so being aides advisors, running political organizations, but having white men lead in the seat. That has changed somewhat over time, but for Black women and many other women of color, in part because of the socioeconomic dynamics where many women of color have always had to work. There wasn't this, stay-at-home model. It was like in two-parent homes, both people were out there hustling. Black women and other women of color have been historically more likely to be in the workplace, but also historically likely to not be appreciated or valued in the workplace. And sometimes in situations where there's harassment and discrimination, or just, the usual jockeying for power, part of it comes down to, can you access proxy power? So can you, as, for example, a white woman, more easily access power by following a powerful male leader than a Black woman or woman of color can? And those create some uncomfortable dynamics where many women of color are left unmentored, unsponsored, and outside of the power structure. And I think one thing that I talk about is that in order to build a more equitable women's power, we have to all play our position, meaning we all, inevitably, and this is not just race and class and gender and sexuality, but everything that we are brings us into a certain dynamic in the workplace. Some people experience anti-gay harassment or gender harassment based on being non-binary or trans, all of these different things. And we have to begin to understand that the way that we're treated in the workplace may not be the way our colleagues are treated. And we shouldn't always assume that if someone says X, Y, or Z happened, you're like, well, I've never seen Bob do that. And it's not just white and women of color. I have a Black former colleague who said to me once, she was so upset. I was driving, like one of these interstate drives, and she was like, I've got to talk right now. And she said, I realized that guy I defended, she's a Black woman. She was like, I realized that guy I defended actually was that guy. He was that Me Too guy, but I couldn't see it. And I shut down other women, in this case, another Black woman who warned me that he was operating in that way. So a lot of times, race is not always the dynamic that affects how we build our networks, but it often does, because just, white women have different types of access to power. So we have to begin to have frank conversations about how the overall power dynamics are affected by race, class, gender. Sorry, something just blew over in a windstorm. Apologies.
Oh no.
It's okay.
No worries.
Nothing broke. It was,
as long as you are safe.
I am fine. I'm grateful for it because it's been steamy here in DC. So I've got all the windows open. But it's about having an awareness and also being willing to step into other people's shoes and to say, for example, my assistant at work at Ford is non-binary, and I don't know exactly how people treat them, but I try to talk to them and understand what their journey through the workplace is, because it's not going to be the same as for me, a cisgendered woman, and so it's really about having a level of humility and operational empathy. But that humility also has to come with the strength to stand up, not just for yourself or your group, but for other people too.
Farai, how do we fix it?
I think it's having tough conversations. Before we hopped on today, I was talking with Erica and you about a tough conversation I had where I feel like presumptions about race and competency, which is another big area, like based on race, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, some people are presumed more competent than others. And this was one where I believed that my race affected how I was viewed as competent or not competent, and in this space, fundable or not fundable for my work. And because I'm in the strange position as I transition out of Ford of being both a funder and someone taking funding for a nonprofit radio show. And so instead of just being like, oh, I wish that meeting went better, let's follow up, I was pretty frank about why I thought the meeting didn't go well, the presumptions I saw. And I said, also, I can't know your motivations. Like, I think I do, but I'm like, I can't know your motivations for why essentially you seem to stereotype my work. I used much nicer words, but essentially let's talk about it. I said, we're going to be in the same rooms for years based on what I'm doing and what you're doing. We're going to be in the same rooms for years. And just, I have the ability, because I don't rely on any one person or entity, to have a tough conversation that someone else isn't privileged enough to have. So part of it is taking our privilege when we have it to have frank and even tough conversations that other people can't have because they need to earn or they need to, just put up with X, Y, or Z to advance. And when I have the power to speak frankly, I do. But getting back to that whole, dynamic between white women and women of color, I was at an institution that unfortunately had both race and gender issues. And as the oldest woman and frankly, the second oldest person at the organization, I took a real lead in dealing with gender issues, but aside from one white woman, the white women never dealt with the race issues. And one thing that I always say is that whiteness is a race too. Everyone has a race. Every race is treated according to sociological constructs. These are not biological constructs. Race is not a biological construct. Like skin color, you can say, well, yeah, you have genes that give you the skin color you do, of course. But there are many white people who are darker than many self-identified Black people, for example. So it's not skin color, it's not hair texture, it's not just national origin. Race is a social construct that we all live within. And if we have to live within it, then let's make it equitable.
No, thank you. Thank you for those words. In your latest book, The Episodic Career, you talk about how to thrive at work in the age of disruption. Given the disproportionate impact COVID has had on women in the workplace, what correlations do you see with your research and how women have downshifted careers and quit their jobs completely?
It's a heartbreaking, it's been a heartbreaking season for a lot of incredible women and also male and non-binary caregivers. I think caregiving is completely undervalued in society, whether it's childcare, elder care, self-care, spousal care, all of those things, community care. Some of us do a lot of work in our communities. And what we're seeing is the breakdown that can happen both in the economy, the labor economy, and in society when we don't value caregiving. Now, some of the things in this new infrastructure bill, it's, I think, in my mind, very positive and critically important that childcare has been contextualized with infrastructure because it is. Many people could not work, dropped out of the workforce because they could not care for their families and work at the same time. And many people feel like it derailed their career, especially for women who were, in those prime, I think that what I've heard the most is like K through 5 years were the roughest. At a certain point, many kids can be more self-sufficient getting on the Zoom calls, et cetera. But like, if you're on a call and then you're like, hold on, a lot of pot stirring, you're teaching at home while working at home while X, Y, or Z. And then there are the people who can't work from home. There was a great documentary, I'm forgetting its name right now, but it's by documentarian, I think it's called Through the Night. Lloyd R. Limbaugh is the documentarian about overnight daycare in New York. Where do kids go when their parents have to work overnight? And so there's all these different care economies. And during the course of that documentary, the documentarian found that many of these overnight daycare centers were shutting down because it was just too hard, especially during the pandemic, where you're trying to save people's lives and not get people infected, and everyone's sleep deprived and anxious. So I try to keep a finger on that. And I do think that we're getting closer as a society to taking the sobering realizations of the pandemic and applying them to caregivers, but it's not there yet. And also, we're still in a pandemic, unfortunately, and it's just an extra burden. It makes everything harder. And so I think that this has been a real wake-up call. The 19th, which is a women and politics news site, the 19thnews.org, has done a whole series on the female recession. And it's absolutely clear from the numbers that the most punishing was to women in the workplace, and so we have a chance to rebuild. Whether or not we do it better is up to us.
What do you foresee, really for the future or work, particularly as it relates to women?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's interesting. In my career, for example, I've had both racial and gender harassment and discrimination. But the thing that I found the most damaging in many ways was back to this idea of perceived competence and what I call intellectual belittlement. Working in places where people just didn't see how, like, I had a situation where I was covering an election cycle, and I ended up doing the best reporting, but I had to fight my editors to do it because I was not perceived to have the same level of competence as my colleagues, even though I'd been in the industry for years. And so there's that level of sort of the competency questions and how women get credentialed. You know, how do you become credentialed as a leader? You know, there are many female leaders who never get the chance to truly lead at the level they need to lead because they're not viewed as competent. And then there's the perceptions about caregiving again. So, I know that we're going to talk a bit about,
Sure.
Another book that I wrote, but I'll save that anecdote for there. But some of the most powerful things came out about how women in the tech industry who are mothers are perceived. But I think that we have a real chance also to begin to design worlds that work for us. So I don't have children. I spent years trying to adopt, which is a long story. But during the pandemic, I had the last adoption opportunity I had was right before the pandemic for two little kids whose parents were not able to raise them, but had a great extended family. And during the pandemic, their grandparents who had been hoping to place them decided to keep them. But what I found was that during the pandemic, I actually was, grateful and relieved not to be a new mother to two kids who didn't know me, locked in an apartment all day long. And I've decided to auntie hard, as I like to say, and to really apply my child care skills to other people's families. So one of my best friends has twins that just had their 3-year-old birthday party this weekend. And I plan to be very much there, to do the kind of long weekend so she and her husband can get away and have a vacation, which is good for their mental health and good for their family's wellness. And to begin, all of this is to say that I think that those of us who are lucky enough to have good social networks or families need to realize that we need to connect more to help each other, and that will help us in the workplace. And then those of us that don't have strong networks can begin to build those. So if you've always wanted to auntie up on someone and you don't have kids in your life to auntie up on, find some, kids that are in your community or in your work circle that you can auntie up on. And if you are a parent who's feeling overwhelmed, try to find those people who can auntie or uncle up on your kids, because we're not going to get through this alone. We're going to get through this together. And we have to, in addition to the formal work environment, we have to build those networks that empower us both at work and at home.
Farai, those are just such pearls of wisdom. I mean, as a mother of 3 young children.
Oh, wow.
Someone dropped in the chat that Vest is, we're going to auntie up. Hey guys,
That's right.
Now.
That's right.
If you just feel that overwhelming need, hey,
How old are they?
I love it, Farai. Those are such true words. Those networks matter. Being able to have support, it matters, and it helps ensure again that we are successful. And your podcast, Our Body Politic, it's unapologetically centered on reporting on not just how women of color experience the major political events of today, but how they're impacting those very issues. Who has been your most interesting guest or conversation, and why?
Oh my gosh, there's so many good ones. Like, Tashara Jones, who's the mayor of St. Louis, who came up through finance. So she worked in both private finance and public finance. And so she has a really great map of like, how do you take a city that has a lot of economic problems and work to put all of the puzzle pieces together. Really enjoyed her. Lasia Clarendon, who is a non-binary WNBA player and an organizer who, helped with the Georgia Senate elections, and really talking about how sports and politics can mix if you want. There's that whole saying, shut up and dribble, and they were like, no, we're not going to shut up and dribble. We are powerful. We have a voice. As athletes, they have a microphone and they can use it. And just today, I interviewed Dana Kester, who runs 100 Days in Appalachia, a news organization that just won a very prestigious award, the Murrow Award. And they basically work in a very interesting way to try to make sure that white teens who are being targeted by white extremist groups are, given other options. And they do it by not just producing award-winning news coverage, but working directly with educators, people in public health, et cetera. So I think that, we've interviewed 3 senators and a lot of other people, but it's not always the people who have the top titles that stand out the most. It's the people with whom I have really thoughtful and surprising conversations.
Incredible. I'm going to journey over so I can
listen
to some of them as well. Tell us about your book, Innovating Women. Tell us.
Yes, exactly. So Innovating Women is a book I co-authored about women in the tech industry. And there was one example of what happened, which is that a female programmer at a high level, was told that she was working mommy hours and that was basically a reason that kept her from promotion. And the thing is, she worked as many hours as the guys. She just worked them at different times. And again, like the amount of frank discrimination that people say, like, to use a phrase like mommy hours should be actionable. But if you're in a system where you're not protected and you have to put up with it, it's just discouraging. And that's why people end up dropping out of the workforce sometimes, is because we're dropping out of their chosen field. And STEM is notorious. I'm forgetting the gaming company, but whatever the gaming company that does World of Warcraft just had a huge Me Too situation. We saw what happened with the governor of New York, et cetera. So any type of workplace can have, whether it's, the kind of Me Too gender-based discrimination or what I call intellectual belittlement and credentialing issues. And so that's definitely something where in that book, Innovating Women, about women in tech, like technology is creating the blueprint for the future. But if women are not allowed to be part of that blueprint, then it's a problem. And I just want to surface one more thing, which is that I interviewed for my show Ifeoma Ozoma, who was at Pinterest and who spoke about the race and gender discrimination there, not Me Too, but credentialing and advancement. And she has been on this really amazing journey to ban NDAs that essentially cover discrimination. Like there's intellectual property NDAs, but then a lot of the NDAs are just a gag rule. And so she's been getting legislation passed through the California legislature and hoping to take it national, saying that if something actionable happened, you cannot NDA someone so they can't talk about it. And that's a lot of why things don't get covered.
As we've seen, particularly in the last few years, the media is such a powerful tool that often influences the way we think and react to situations. Unfortunately, we continue to see a huge lack of diversity in the newsroom. Why is that? And what is next for diversity in media?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it has to do with that question of intellectual belittlement. I mean, after many years, I have just come to believe that certain managers do not trust, in various cases, women, people of color, women of color. Also, journalism used to be a field that had a lot of working class people, but increasingly it's become professionalized in a way that blocks working class people. And if you are someone who is working class and perceived as such, some newsrooms will, look down the nose. And all of that is bad. We need everyone. We need people of every race, every gender, every background in the newsrooms. Because what we're really doing, I think that, to me, the way that I think about truth is that there is big T absolute truth. But as a human being, I'm not going to see it just off the bat. I have to go on a quest. It is kind of a heroic quest to look for the truth. And for me as a reporter, my tools have been interviews, data, history, all these things. And I have to go on a quest for the truth. But even then, my quest for the truth has to be informed by other people's quest for the truth. And where we disagree, we have to discuss it. And in some ways, in addition to all the power struggles in newsrooms, I think it's also a question of conflict resolution. I think healthy newsrooms have disagreements about what they should do, what they should print or broadcast, et cetera. And you have to have a system for adjudicating these conflicts to get the best, most truthful news. But in places where one culture, whether it's, based on race, class, gender, or some combination thereof, or things like, I went to Harvard, for example, and when I was a young reporter, I told another person at the place I was working in my early 20s, there's too many Ivy League people and too many Harvard people here. Like, I'm glad to be here, but how are we going to actually know what's going on if everyone had to be rubber stamped by the same schools? And he didn't take it well. And, I was also benefiting from that privilege, but I saw it. And yet, as a Black woman who'd grown up in a working class Black neighborhood, I just knew that we were missing a lot of voices. So sometimes it's about coming from that position of privilege that you have and being able to speak for others. But I think that unfortunately the news industry is pretty defensive and pretty, we haven't been learning well. But that said, last thing is that new waves of both for-profit and nonprofit investment are bringing online some amazing people who are building their own newsrooms. So there's an entity that Ford funds and many others fund called MLK 50, Justice Through Journalism. And it was started in Memphis, Tennessee, and within 3 years had won huge awards because they had gotten millions of dollars in predatory medical debt discharged against thousands of people. That is high impact journalism that transforms people's lives, people who thought they might lose their house and they were being hounded by a nonprofit hospital in ways that did not meet the hospital's own policies about discharging the debt of low income people. So I think that, there's still that promise of journalism as something that lifts us up and allows us to lead better lives. So I don't want to make it seem that I've soured on the whole process. I still really believe it can be powerful.
And it seems that innovative approaches like the one you just described is how things are going to change, or certainly it's going to move forward in getting those diverse perspectives. Farai, you are an internationally sought out speaker, author, researcher, multimedia journalist, and program officer at the Ford Foundation. How do you manage it all?
Well, part of it is that I don't have kids, and I'm just going to be real about that. Like, I was able, essentially through much of the pandemic, I was working 2 jobs at Ford and with Ford's permission, doing this radio show. And I wouldn't have been able to do it. So some of it too is just understanding that certain cycles in your life, you do have to focus on self-care. There's certainly been phases of my life where I've had to self-care or other care. I moved back to Maryland in part because my mother's starting to have memory declines and she's still in pretty good shape. And I wanted to spend good time with her, because this is progressive. And I was able, because I am the person who determines my own schedule, I was able to move interstate, do some, not elder care in the traditional sense, but elder management, as well as social time with my mom. And I don't want to say it's just because I don't have kids. That's not right. It's because I have access to free time that I was able to do it. And I think that women with children or with elder care or other care responsibilities need to be supported in finding access to ways to free up that time. But I know not everyone has it. That's the point. And I also don't intend to stir as many pots always, because I really believe that no matter who you are, you need time for self-care, reflection. If you have a spiritual practice, that spiritual practice, and just goofing around. We deserve to have time to goof around. So for me, I feel very supported by my family, my friends, my professional network. I feel very lucky.
What's a piece of advice you wish someone would have shared with you earlier in your career to get you to leapfrog through career advancement?
I think that a couple of things. First of all, that future success is not predicated on past success. You may have done something in your life that just didn't work out, either because you weren't suited for the job. You know, I've had jobs where I was like, how did I end up here? This is totally not my sweet spot. So maybe you didn't work out, maybe they didn't work out, whatever. And you can't beat yourself up about it. All you can do is learn from the experience and keep going. And so a lot of people are like that, you know, think that life, and I talk about this in the episodic career, that the career used to be like an elevator, which is you got on at the bottom, you went up, and then you got off at the end. They gave you a gold watch and you went to retirement. Now you can have like, you know, you start out and then you're unemployed and then you get like this, you know, great job. And then, you know, a pandemic hits, like it can be all over the place. But if you keep focused on what value you can deliver within the systems that you're in, and also valuing yourself over any system, that is important. And by that, I don't mean the sort of idea of the flighty, I'm all for myself employee, but like, for example, if you are working yourself sick, you have to value your own healing, or you're not, whether it's physically sick, emotionally sick, you know, otherwise. Like there are so many people who try to just press on through everything. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you need to take a break or restructure things so that you have the ability to heal and grow, whether it's after an operation or after a big life event. And I think that, first of all, because of the structure of how Americans generally set up work differently than other developed countries, like in Europe, for example, in Germany, if you give birth to a child, you can get your job back 3 years later, your job or equivalent. You won't get paid that whole time. You get paid for a certain amount of it. But you can take 3 years and re-enter the workforce without fear of penalty. That's not how it works here. You know, so people end up frazzling themselves. And the same thing with sick leave sometimes. You know, there's a lot of jobs that just, even if they have benefits, they don't have paid sick leave. And if you can't afford to be sick, you know, that's been a big axis of, frankly, the spread of COVID, people who can't afford to be sick. So they show up in any kind of state. But I think that moving ahead, one of the lessons for me, because I'm on the cusp of likely starting a for-profit media holding company. And so I've done my own work as a small scale entrepreneur, but I'm really talking about something larger scale that also redirects capital to underrepresented and underfunded creators. And so because I've taken time to learn about how capital flows in this industry, I want to be a conduit that doesn't just keep it all for myself, but helps spread it to others. And that's not something I could have predicted. It's not a linear path from anything I've ever done. But we can't underestimate our ability to meet the moment, whether that moment is one where we feel undervalued or ones where we feel maybe overvalued is the wrong word, but out of our league. You know, I try not to feel that I'm out of my league anymore. I try to ask, what support do I need to play in this league? You know, if I've been playing like, you know, high school hoops and then I'm being asked to the WNBA, it's like, what support do I need to play in that league and, you know, apply that to business? You know, it's about finding the right structure. So right now I have a therapist, a nutritionist and yoga teacher, and an executive coach, and then like multiple business mentors. That's what it takes for me to play in this league at this time.
That's remarkable. I've been feverishly taking notes because you so many just great words, phrases, resources. And so this is incredible. Well, now we're going to open it up to, you know, for questions. And this is the time for our members. Don't be shy to dive in and ask some questions. If you'll drop them in the chat, I will keep them moving forward. I know that we do have, I was reading the chat. I know Miss Lucas, Erica has a question. So Erica, if you want to dive in now, go for it. And then I've got a question after you.
When we launched VEST, we actually heard from women that didn't necessarily saw not only the value that we could bring by getting women together to support one another, but they actually said that it might actually hurt because we were creating more divide or being dismissive of men or others. And also, I even had somebody, you mentioned the Me Too movement. I had somebody said that the Me Too movement has hurt women more so in the workplace than it actually hurt, that it has actually helped.
and that was from another woman. What do you have to say to that? Or have you ever experienced similar feedback?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a little bit of all of it, and I think that I 100% support the Me Too movement. I don't think it hurts women, except, sort of going back to something I said earlier, women who either consciously or inadvertently end up supporting Me Too men. Like, so if a Me Too man is your patron, you may feel threatened if it turns out that you have to lose your patron because his behavior no longer makes him, qualified to be an executive. So there are people who, for their own reasons, but the reality is, we all deserve safe workplaces where we are viewed for our accomplishments and not for our dress size or whatever, and so my biggest issue with the Me Too movement isn't about the Me Too movement at all. It's about how when certain people commit Me Too offenses that come out, they usually get fired or sanctioned, but they can do any number of other things to block women from advancement, and that is much harder to prove and to deal with. So I am very supportive of the Me Too movement. I think people who are like, oh, it's making it worse. Like, why do you think that? What's making you uncomfortable about this? Are you losing a patron? Do you think that people who are protecting your career are, getting scrutiny? So, and it's uncomfortable. It's just uncomfortable. But we have to believe that we deserve safe workplaces where we face the same chances of being promoted and elevated based on merit.
So along those lines, Farai, I had a question that was sent to me that was via text. And it basically says, some of my biggest adversaries have been women.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to show up, do my job, and be great. Why do some women make it difficult for others to succeed? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of my friends from the reporting world said many years ago, the best people in the world are women, followed by the men, followed by the rest of the women. Now, that's obviously a stereotype, which is very binary, but I do think that women, we can play a really tough emotional game. Women, because we don't have some of the same levers to power as many men in some cases, I think there's a lot of emotional manipulation that women use against each other in the workplace when things go bad. Now, in a healthy workplace, so for example, my executive producer on the show is another strong woman of color, Dominican immigrant, et cetera. And when we clash, I set up, a meeting and we talk it out and we hug it out and we keep going. And even when I'm offering a critique, I just say, I appreciate you. Because it's like, this is a critique of a process. It's not a critique of you as a person. So sometimes people who don't have that clarity about how to communicate will be emotionally triggering when they don't want to be. But I think more often, some women just use, words and emotions as weapons. And to give another example, someone warned me in advance of a woman who used crying as a tool to get what she wanted. And so, having been warned in advance, the first time I was her manager, the first time she started crying during a meeting, I said, well, if you need to, feel free to excuse yourself and compose yourself. And I'm sorry that you're upset, but we still have to get this done. She never cried again. Because I was like, I'm not unsympathetic. You can take a pause, but we have a deliverable. And she never cried again, which let me know that it was a tactic. So sometimes it's just about like meeting game with game.
No, yes, I'm sure we've all experienced that. We have Vest member Anna Wake shared in the chat that early in her career, she was told she wouldn't succeed because she spent too much time with her family or with her, and so they saw family as a weakness instead of a strength. What advice would you give someone facing something similar to that in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't have any in front of me, but I think that there's a lot of evidence-based research as well as storytelling about how the word that first popped to mind is thrifty. That's not the right word, but how efficient working parents can be. You know, like you have to be an efficiency expert to get your job done. And there's a lot of new interesting information coming out about like ways that you can stack your, like the people who are turning out to be successful at work from home, take micro breaks. You know, like don't try to take the hour-long meeting, make it a 45-minute meeting, hit a reset, especially if you're caregiving or parenting, but also just for yourself. So I make all my formerly hour-long meetings, when I can, 45-minute meetings, so that everyone has a chance to hit a reset. And if you have some self-care or other care to do, you have time to refresh. We need to be kinder to each other. And I think that, you know, I will see, you know, I'll try to see if I can find any of the research on it, but all of, you know, I have, you know, one of my friends has been a huge news executive while raising twin toddlers in the pandemic. You know, it can be done. And this person just got 5 Emmy nominations for their work, 5 Emmy nominations, which are basically the TV Oscars, you know? And so it can be done. But if you have a manager that doesn't believe in you, it's really, the hard part is that even if you do bring in evidence-based research, it may not do it. If you have a manager who just isn't willing to believe in you. So I think it's a question of like, is it something that you can fix? Like this is a misperception that you can fix, or do you just have to leave? I mean, I'm a big believer not to leave on a whim, but if someone has put you in a box and decided that you're not up for the job and that no amount of evidence will or success will be otherwise, you've got to get out when you can, which might not be today or tomorrow. Hopefully it's not to that point in your case. But I think that that's, first of all, just so pejorative and narrow-minded. And we have seen so much success among working parents throughout the pandemic under really tough conditions.
Brilliant. And sometimes the cultures are such that there's no alignment with your values and your morals and what it takes for you to show up and be eager and happy and excited. And you do have to create those exit strategies. It's just a part of life.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, who wants to know, can you share some tips for starting a conversation about exploring how others are experiencing the workplace? Do you have some tips about how to start those?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to have shared expectations going into it. Like, for example, I really dislike a lot of the ways that some companies do DEI conversations. It's like, we're going to have it once a year, and, you know, like there's just all these expectations crammed into things. And to be able to really say, we are going to have a series of aligned conversations where we set out the intent in advance, and we have, you know, some protocols. So maybe instead of going straight like into like the deep stuff, shallow waters first. You know, one of the things I've thought about, this is, you know, like random, but not random, is that I've thought Our Body Politics first anniversary is coming up next month. And I've thought about doing a set of cards. You know, there's like all different sorts of cards that people use for workplace or whatever interactions that would pose some tough questions that are like aligned with the kinds of tough issues we do, but then also have getting to know you questions so that you could flow back and forth between discussing tough issues and then going back into that safer space of going to your own personal experience. Like, you know, questions about like, what do you know about how your grandparents viewed race? You know, like, you know, and that's still a complicated question, but it's not asking you to go beyond a certain point. Or even like, you know, what's your, like things that are much softer, like what's your favorite childhood memory? Because I think that like, very often we try to go 100 and we're just so tense because everything is like on the line. We need to treat these conversations more as human conversations where we give each other pauses, rest, chances to laugh. Don't try to pack everything into one day. You know, got to build those relationships in order to do the heavy lifting. That's my biggest complaint.
Absolutely. Anna Wake has another one. Thank you. And I know some of you out there have some burning questions. We want them because we have a few more minutes for this brilliant person to share their expertise, to share your expertise with us. You spoke a bit about mentors. Mentorship for women, and in particular, women of color, can be challenging. Can you share how you found your mentors and a little bit about nurturing those relationships?
Yeah, I've been so lucky and also have worked hard at it. And what I mean by that is my current mentor is a longtime media executive, Randy Siegel, who is the CEO of Dennis North America. And that was a friend introduction, like a mutual friend of ours introduced us, and we just, started talking. And at the time he was running a newspaper company, but like he's really been a great business mentor to me. And, it's, at first I just didn't know what he wanted. I was like, what do you want? And I was very paranoid. I was like, and then I just realized that he's just someone who has a generous spirit, and also he really sees promise in me. And, I intend to do some work with him on a professional level down the road. But I think if you have bad experiences, sometimes it's hard to trust. And so I said to him, over a year into our relationship, I was introducing him to someone in a very, intimate, frank, conversation. I said, Randy, is a white male executive who I trust deeply. And it took me a long time to trust him, and based on some of the past experiences I've had. And and part of our relationship is that I can say that to him and to other people without it being weird. It's like, I acknowledge that I have trust issues around race and gender and leadership. And he can receive that without feeling some kind of way about it. You know what I mean? And that's part of it, is that you develop that frankness. And so he's also someone, and I love to say this, is like, it wasn't until 3 years after we had been meeting almost every week that he told me that his father was personal friends with Martin Luther King Jr. And what I like to say is, like, for most, white people trying to gain points, the first thing they say is like, oh, I'm friends with someone who looks like you or whatever. And it's like, he knew that wasn't what our relationship was about. He came with his values. He didn't come with his credentials. And so I think that for me, I always look for people where I'm aligned with their values, because, and I'm lucky that I've had, my first mentor was a white man and was fantastic. And later I had some very negative experiences with white men. So I also try not to judge, but I also know that the way humans are, that we do make snap judgments. That's part of what we do, but I don't have to live in my snap judgments. I can make snap judgments and then check myself and be like, you know what, you just made a snap judgment. Like, why don't you marinate on this? Why don't you marinate on your perspective and what baggage you're bringing to the table, and try not to bring it to the table, And I'm much more comfortable vetting my own biases than pretending they don't exist. And that's also something that people should be encouraged to do, not always out loud, because that's not always the most appropriate place, but internally, to acknowledge that we all come from someplace and have had certain experiences, but we don't have to live in that trauma.
Love it.
So also I would say I'm very consistent about outreach and networking. So my sister, for example, who's a wonderful person, very skilled, professional, she's always like, oh, well, they didn't get back to me. I'm like, I've got the 3 email rule. I email, I don't hear back from you. I wait. I email. I don't hear back from you. I wait. I email again. And that's it. 3rd time, I'm out. If I don't hear from you by time 3, we're done. But we're not one and done. I don't believe in one and done. Sometimes you miss something and it's not even personal. And sometimes someone's having a life event. So I think that also in seeking mentors, it's about finding people in your circle and outside of your circle who are values aligned, and then, being consistent in that contact.
If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review and subscribe to our podcast for future episodes. You can also join the conversation by becoming a VEST member. Go to www.vester.co and apply today.